All right, I'm Professor Van Norden, and this is Neo-Confucianism and Chinese Buddhism. And today I'm going to be lecturing on mostly 20th century Chinese history. But to really understand what's going on with 20th century Chinese history, we have to get a bit of a running start with the Qing Dynasty. So the Qing Dynasty is the last imperial dynasty, and this is a reproduction of a painting of the Kang Emperor. And he reigned during a period of great cultural efflorescence in China. The arts were doing great. The economy was doing great. China was also expanding militarily. And so under the Kang Emperor, China gained control of Tibet. China gained control of the island of Taiwan. And China also had considerable influence over Korea during this period. Nonetheless, within a century after the death of the Kangxi Emperor, the Chinese Empire was in serious trouble. 2 centuries after his death, the last Chinese dynasty and the imperial system were gone forever. What happened? 3 major events in the 19th century helped bring the Qing Dynasty to a close: the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the First Sino-Japanese War. So let's take a quick look at each of these things. So British merchants in the 19th century faced a problem because there was a trade imbalance with China. So Britain was importing a lot of tea from China, which was being used to keep workers awake and active on their long shifts in British factories. But China was largely self-sufficient and didn't have anything it needed to import from Britain. So enterprising British merchants in places like Hong Kong figured out how to create a market for something they could sell to China. They started importing large amounts of opium from India, which was also controlled by the British Empire at this point, to China, thereby creating a drug problem in China, which they could keep supporting the drug problem by importing opium and thereby addressing the trade imbalance with China. Now, China didn't like having a drug dependency problem, so they outlawed the importation of opium. And Great Britain, so to speak, took the moral high ground, that's irony, by waging the Opium Wars against China to force China to allow the importation of opium to keep the drug abuse problem going and solve the trade balance problem that the UK had with China. Now, for various reasons that we could teach an entire separate course on, at this point in history, the Western powers more advanced scientifically and technologically, including military technology, than were countries like China. So in the Opium War, the British military made short work of the Chinese forces. This is a painting from that era. And if you're a naval history buff, you'll enjoy the fact that in the background of the painting, that's a representation of the HMS Nemesis, which is the first steam-powered ocean-going warship, and it belonged to the British Navy. And as this painting represents, the HMS Nemesis made very short work of the Chinese naval war junks that were sent to fight it. And the same thing happened in land battles. So China was decisively defeated in the Opium Wars. The second awful thing that happened to China in the 19th century was the Taiping Rebellion. So there was this guy who had repeatedly taken the civil service examinations in China, and he was getting sad because he kept failing the exams. But then, in a dream, he had an insight. In this vision he had, he discovered an interesting fact about himself. This Chinese guy, it turned out, was Jesus's younger brother. And as Jesus's younger brother, he led a kind of schismatic Christian, it wasn't an Orthodox Christian, but kind of like a schismatic Christian rebellion against the Qing Dynasty government. And he and his followers called themselves the Kingdom of Heavenly Peace, the Taiping. Now, eventually, the Taiping Rebellion was put down. but not after about 20 million Chinese died as a result of fighting and also the food disruptions, famines, and diseases that occur as a concomitant of widespread warfare. And this is a contemporary Chinese painting showing some of the take a major city in China. So although again, the Qing powers won, in the long run, was very disruptive of Chinese society and culture and revealed the weakness of the Qing regime. The last major disruption in the 19th century was what we in the West call the First Sino-Japanese War. So in the 19th century, and again, you could teach a whole course just on this, Japan was able to rapidly modernize with the so-called Meiji Restoration. And in the Meiji Restoration, almost overnight, samurai traded in their swords for the briefcases of business people and went abroad to study. One Japanese woman during this period actually came to Vassar and became the first Japanese woman to get a bachelor's degree. So Japan rapidly modernized with the Meiji Restoration in the 19th century, so that by the end of the 19th century, Japan was essentially technologically like a modern Western power, and they began the imperialism modeled on the imperialism they saw on the Western powers. So Japan fought a war with China and won decisively. As a result of this war, Taiwan was ceded to Japan. It was controlled by Japan until the end of World War II. Also, Korea came under Japanese control as well. So this was a real shock to people in China, because China had always thought of itself as the cultural and also military and diplomatic center of East Asia. And it was bad enough being defeated by Western powers, but being defeated by Japan, which, as I say, had rapidly modernized, was really a shock. As a result of the weakness that China had shown in the face of foreign aggression, Western diplomats openly began to talk about carving the Chinese melon. And what that meant was dividing up China into spheres of influence, in which foreign governments effectively controlled large parts of China and made their own laws and basically had legal jurisdiction over citizens of their country living in this part of China. I mean, now when I visit China, I'm subject to the laws and the courts of China. If a Chinese person visits the United States, they're subject to the laws and courts of the United States. But because of the extraterritoriality that had been granted to the Western powers, if you were, say, a British citizen in a British-controlled part of China, you were subject to British law, not to Chinese law. And this chart shows how various countries effectively controlled different parts of China around 1910. Now, there were efforts to try to reform, and one of the most famous was the 100 Days of Reform of 1898. And two of the leaders of the 100 Days of Reform were these guys, Kang Youwei and his disciple or student Liang Qichao. And they tried to make China into more like a constitutional monarchy modeled on the United Kingdom, say. But their reform was squelched by conservatives in the Chinese government, led by the Empress Dowager Shih, who staged a counter coup. As a result of this, the Empress Dowager Shih has a really negative reputation in China. But there have recently been some efforts to rehabilitate her and to suggest that, in fact, she was responsible for a lot of reforms in China at the end of the 19th century, and that she didn't get credit for her reform efforts because she was a woman. But the standard story is these guys tried to have a kind of constitutional, a reform in the direction of a constitutional monarchy, and their reform was squelched by the Empress Dowager Shih. Now, if you have any awareness of Chinese history, you know that Chinese dynasties come and go. I mean, we've had so many dynasties since the Shih dynasty, the apparently mythical dynasty so far as we know in ancient China, up through the Qing dynasty. So the fact that the Qing dynasty was on its last legs wasn't in itself shocking. This happens. But there was something distinctive about this dynastic crisis. In the past, you could always represent the fall of a dynasty as the failure of the dynasty to live up to the ideal, the true ideals of Chinese civilization. And usually this came in the form of saying that, well, we haven't been truthful enough or faithful enough to the true teachings of Confucianism. With this next dynasty, we're going to get it right. But now the problem was that it appeared that it was the traditional systems of thought themselves that were the problem. Because when people saw how weak they were compared to the Western powers and how weak China seemed compared to Japan, which had rapidly modernized and adopted Western-style institutions and teachings, people thought, this isn't just another dynastic failure. This is the failure of traditional thought itself. So broadly speaking, in the early 20th century, you saw three approaches to what was wrong with China. And that symbolized, these are not the only figures involved in these movements, but symbolically there's liberalism, communism, and New Confucianism that dominate Chinese thought up to the present day. And liberalism here, I'm using this in the classic sense, where it includes both free market advocates of laissez-faire, as well as advocates of Western-style competitive democracy, and Western-style rule of law and civil rights, things like that. Communism, of course, would eventually come to dominate in the Soviet Union, and some people in China wanted to model China on that model. But then later in the 20th century, you get a movement which comes to be known by the label of New Confucianism, which is a movement to argue for the continuing relevance of Confucian ideals and institutions in the modern world. And we'll look a little bit more at each of these in today's lecture. So with the failure of the 100 Days of Reform and the increasing weakness of the Qing Dynasty, many young intellectuals were attracted to what came to be known as the New Culture movement. And as the name New Culture suggests, the idea behind the New Culture movement is that China needs a new culture, primarily a Western-style culture, so that China's got to abandon the three teachings of Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. China has to abandon traditional cosmology. China has to abandon a traditional feudal, they called them, systems of government in favor of modern technology, modern science. And Shih was a leading thinker in this movement. I gave in readings in later Chinese philosophy by T. Walden Van Norden. I gave you a selection from Shih, where he's very pro-Western and anti-traditional thought. Lu Xun is one of the greatest early modern Chinese writers. I've often said that if I did nothing with the Chinese I learned, other than learning about Lu Xun and reading his writings, it would have been worth it because his short stories are so great. I often assign short stories by Lu Xun like The True Story of Q, or Kung Yi, or one of my favorites is Diary of a Madman. And I have copies of Diary of a Madman and Kung Yi if you'd like to read those in translation. But so he just kind of like overnight, people like Lu Xun invented a vernacular style of Chinese literature to replace the style of writing in classical Chinese. And Shih studied Western philosophy in the United States and then came back and tried to bring Western philosophical ideas to China. So this was one of the responses to the conflict or the problems in China. Now, the Qing dynasty finally sputtered to an end in 1911, and it was replaced by the Republic of China. The first president of the Republic of China is Sun Zhongshan, who's normally known in English as Sun Yat-sen, which is vaguely modeled on the Cantonese pronunciation of his name. And whatever your background, I mean, Sun Yat-sen, Sun Zhongshan is seen as like the founder of modern China, and so it's okay to admire him. But Sun Yat-sen was soon replaced as president of the Republic of China by Yuan Shikai, who was a former Qing general. And not satisfied with being president, Yuan Shikai declared himself emperor and tried to found a new dynasty. And that wasn't as crazy as it sounds, because China had always had a dynasty, and he thought, well, we just need a new dynasty. But as you can see, he didn't live very long after that. And so he died apparently of natural causes. But all of this showed that the Republic of China was not on a very firm footing. Now, one of the things that ends, I mean, what officially ends World War I is the Treaty of Versailles. And if you know anything about early 20th century history, you know that the Treaty of Versailles was a disaster in a lot of ways. It ended up creating conditions which led to the rise of Nazism later in Germany. Another unfair thing that the Treaty of Versailles did was there were parts, remember we looked at carving up the Chinese melon, and there were parts of China that were controlled by Germany prior to World War I. China had joined the Allied side in World War I with the promise that at the end of the war, when Germany was defeated, the German territories in China would be returned to Chinese control. In fact, what actually happened is that at the Treaty of Versailles, they gave the parts of China that had been controlled by Germany to Japan instead. And so China still didn't control those parts of China. When news of this reached China on May 4th, 1919, it led to widespread protests against the weakness of the current Chinese government and further calls for reform and rejection of traditional culture. One of the slogans, and students were very involved in these protests. This is a largely student group of protests being portrayed in this painting. And one of their slogans, which you can see on one of the signs in the painting, is overturn the shop of Confucius. Da Dao Kung Jia Dian. That means overturn the shop of Confucius. And what that meant was, let's just get rid of all traditional thought, and we have to rapidly modernize and strengthen China. So in many ways, the May 4th movement is kind of a continuation of the New Culture movement, but it's more militant, it's more, so to speak, in your face, and many intellectuals, students, but also workers and government officials were involved in this movement. Another effect of the May 4th movement was the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 by these guys, Li Dazhao and Cheng Dushou. So now with 2020 hindsight, you might think, well, why would anybody, side with communism? We know it didn't turn out well in the Soviet Union. It didn't turn out well in North Korea. We're going to see it didn't turn out all that well in China. But if you look at it from the perspective of the people in China at the time, the United States and the United Kingdom and France, these capitalist, supposedly democratic states, had sold out China in the Treaty of Versailles. And communist thinkers came along and said, we can explain why it's inevitable that capitalist states are going to sell out countries like China and will only look after their own interest. And we can give you a theory about why China is having problems right now. We have a theory about why these countries sold you out. And obviously you can't trust the Western capitalist states anyway. So communism seemed like a very attractive alternative to many intellectuals at this point in history around the world. Eventually, war broke out between the supporters of the Nationalist Party, who dominated the government in the Republic of China, and the Communist Party, which would later found the People's Republic of China on the mainland. And in the first part of this civil war, the nationalists won overwhelmingly. They almost wiped out the communists completely, so that the communists were forced to engage in a long retreat referred to as the Long March. So if you looked at China at a certain point, you would have said, well, the Communist Party is obviously on its way out. The nationalists are about to win. So what happened? Now, remember, I said that Japan had rapidly modernized in the 19th century and was copying the imperialism that was so characteristic of the Western powers. So Japan, the Japanese government, convinced itself that it should take over all of East Asia. And so they provoked a war with China. And this is a map showing the farthest extent of Japanese control of East Asia and also parts of Southeast Asia. So as you can see, Japan controlled Korea, which was not divided into North and South Korea at this point. Japan controlled Taiwan. Island's going to be very important later. And they also controlled large parts of China and also what is now Vietnam. Back then it was called French Indochina. So this is as far as Japan got. And the war, in fairness, it was very bloody. This is a famous news photograph of a baby crying in the ruins of Shanghai after Japanese bombing. And there were medical experiments that were performed on unwilling Chinese civilians by the Japanese military. And both Korean and Chinese women were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. Professor Pepe Cho at Vassar College is the author of a landmark book on the so-called comfort women of China who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. So it was a horrible conflict. I think to this day, when you visit mainland China, there are every day of the week you can watch a miniseries set in the time of what is called in China the War of Resistance against Japan. And as a foreigner, I find them fun to watch, but they do kind of fan the flames of anti-Japanese sentiment in Japan. So I think we need to remember World War II, but my personal recommendation would be to also remember that all of this happened a long time ago, even before your old professor was born. So remember the past, but also don't blame contemporary people for what their ancestor did, would be my personal recommendation. So when Japan was defeated at the end of World War II, the civil war between the nationalists and the communists started up again. This time, the communists won. And in 1949, they founded the People's Republic of China. And this is a painting of Mao Zedong announcing the founding of the People's Republic of China from the Gate of Heavenly Peace, which looks out on the square, Tiananmen Square in China. So from this point on in, you've got two Chinese governments, each of them claiming to be the sole government of all of China. You've got the People's Republic of China that controls the mainland, and then you've got the Republic of China, which largely controls the island of Taiwan and a handful of other islands off the coast of the mainland. And if your family is of Chinese descent, or if you have friends who have families of Chinese descent, you'll know this is a real hot button issue, what the status is of the Republic of China on Taiwan versus the People's Republic of China on the mainland. Again, both governments claim to be the sole government of China. And sometimes they can manage to get along, but for a lot of their history, there's been a lot of tension. And recently, we just learned from documents that were classified but that were leaked that the United States almost used nuclear weapons against China in 1958 during a period of tension between the US and China over Taiwan. And even since then, the US has repeatedly sent aircraft carrier strike forces to Taiwan to show support for Taiwan during periods of tension between the mainland and Taiwan. Again, if you're of Chinese descent or you've got friends who are Chinese descent, this is a real hot button issue, and people have very strong opinions about this and about US involvement, either pro or con. But you should know that the US is committed to defending Taiwan, the Republic of China, in the event that it's attacked by the People's Republic of China. There is an increasingly influential movement on Taiwan for Taiwan to declare itself a completely independent country and renounce unification with mainland China. In the event that that happens, the government of mainland China has said that it will then invade Taiwan. If that happens, the US is committed to defending Taiwan. I'm too old to be drafted, but you're not. And so you could be drafted to fight in a war which could occur any day if Taiwan declares independence from the mainland. So, and most of you probably before this lecture didn't even know there was a difference between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China. There is, and it's very important. So please be aware of that. So anyway, on the mainland, Mao took charge, and Mao had some economic and social theories, which I think we might politely describe as kind of flaky. And so during the Great Leap Forward, Mao encouraged people to break with thousands of years of tradition about farming and to use much more intensive kinds of farming than farmers had traditionally used. He also encouraged people to produce steel in backyard furnaces. So take all the iron they could find, all the tools of iron, even nails, rip them out of the wall, throw them into a backyard furnace and start making steel to jumpstart the Chinese economy. Problems with both of these ideas. There's a reason farmers weren't doing the kind of intensive farming that the Maoists wanted them to do. They weren't doing it because it didn't work. In addition, you cannot make steel in a backyard furnace. You need a high temperature furnace, and you need to blast oxygen in to get rid of impurities to make steel. So as a result of Mao's policies in the Great Leap Forward, massive crop failures on top of many usable, useful tools being destroyed and melted down into utterly useless pig iron in these backyard furnaces. Now, at first, people didn't want to tell Mao the bad news because they thought they would get in trouble for reporting that people were literally starving in the countryside. But fortunately, eventually, they did tell Mao this. This is a contemporary Chinese communist poster of the Great Leap Forward. I know it looks really weird. Why is everybody out here in the water like this? It's actually modeled on a traditional poster of the 8 Taoist immortals crossing the sea, which to this day you can find this, and I've seen this in a lot of Chinese restaurants in the US. It's a fun traditional representation, but the poster's modeled on that. That's fun. What's a lot less fun is that approximately 20 million Chinese starved to death during the Great Leap Forward. Imagine traveling throughout New York State, from Manhattan all the way upstate. Imagine every town, every road, every gas station, no people, because everybody in New York State was dead of starvation. That's how many people starved to death under the Great Leap Forward. Let's not forget that. So then what happened was that when the people finally started to come to grips with how badly things were going in the Great Leap Forward, some of the moderates in government, including a guy by the name of Deng Xiaoping and a philosopher named Liu Shaoqi, started to edge Mao out of power. They weren't threatening his life. They weren't going to get rid of him completely, but they said, we need a more moderate approach to government. Mao's response to this was to launch the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. And he encouraged students, certainly university students, but often high school students, in some cases, even grade school students, to drop out of school, join the paramilitary Red Guards, and root out the last vestiges of capitalism and feudalism from Chinese society. And so the Red Guards went around, and with all the subtlety of the Salem witch trials and all the kindness of the Inquisition, they rooted out everybody they thought was a sympathizer, a rightist or a sympathizer. This is a Cultural Revolution era poster showing Mao Zedong surrounded by ecstatic Red Guards waving copies of the Little Red Book, the quotations of Chairman Mao. In this particular poster, right behind Mao is Lin Biao. Everybody who surrounded Mao sooner or later was purged. Lin Biao died trying to flee China for the Soviet Union, where his plane was shot down as he tried to flee. The only person, the supporter of Mao, who made it all the way to the end of his life was Zhou Enlai, who was such a good politician that he managed to survive all the purges around Mao. But so Mao launched this ultra left-wing activity, the Great Cultural Revolution, basically to get power back and to purge his enemies. And both Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi were purged from power. Liu Shaoqi died in prison. Deng Xiaoping was treated horribly in prison, but did survive. China's current leader, Xi Jinping, was young during the Cultural Revolution, but he was also abused and bullied during the Cultural Revolution. Now, this is a stele from, like, a memorial tablet from Confucius's hometown of Chufu. And if you look on it, you can see some graffiti that's been written on it in Chinese. And it turns out that graffiti was put on this stele honoring Confucius by members of the Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution. And it's been left behind, the graffiti's been left there as a reminder of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. So what did these radical students write on defacing a memorial tablet to the sage Confucius? In Chinese, it's Gaming Uzui, which is roughly, revolution is not a crime. So a lot of people suffered a great deal due to persecution by the Red Guards in the Cultural Revolution. I've met people who've been through it and have talked about some of the horrors that they've been through. But to give you a sense of what the time was like, this is a frame from a poster whose title is, in English, The Evil Life of Old Kung, meaning the evil life of old Confucius. And I'm going to include a link there's a web page a colleague has where he's got the poster and he's got photographs of each of the little cells, little frames on the poster. And he's also translated what each of them says. But basically, it's like a poster which gives you like a brief comic book type presentation of the life of Confucius. But instead of praising Confucius and talking about what a great sage he is, it's a discussion of what an evil person Confucius was. And in this particular frame, you can see here, you've got these work proletariat, I mean, not technically speaking proletariat, but you've got peasants in the background, and they're tall and masculine looking and kind of buff. And notice how they're staring daggers at this weaselly little figure in the foreground. That weaselly little figure in the foreground, that's supposed to be Confucius. And so this whole poster is about how evil Confucius was and how he was supporting reactionary causes and how we should all hate Confucius. So that's why the Red Guard are defacing Confucius's temple in his hometown. Now, so what are people in favor of during the Cultural Revolution? The only thing they're really in favor of is Mao Zedong. And the quotations from Chairman Mao, the Little Red Book, is widely distributed in this era. But there's an interesting thing about this work. The Little Red Book, technically it's Mao Zhu Shi Yu Lu, the recorded sayings of Chairman Mao. Kind of reminds you of another little book The Analects attributed to Confucius, or Lunyu, might be more literally the categorized sayings of Master Kung. Well, isn't that a coincidence? So Mao is criticizing what he calls feudal thought, but in distributing a collection of his brief sayings modeled on the brief sayings of Confucius, Mao is representing himself as the new sage who should be worshipped in the way that people used to worship sages like Confucius. But at the same time, there's many important differences between the political thought of Confucius and the political thought of Mao Zedong. So, for example, in the Analects, Confucius says, "The virtue of a gentleman is like the wind, and the virtue of the petty person is like the grass. When the wind moves over the grass is sure to bend." In other words, you don't need to use force to govern people. Your virtue will have a transformative effect on others if you just allow it to have that effect. In contrast, Mao says, in quotations from Chairman Mao, "Every communist must grasp the truth. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." Meanwhile, outside of China, in Taiwan, still controlled by the Republic of China, and in Hong Kong, which had been ceded to British control as a result of the Opium Wars, and which remained under British control until 1997, when it was returned to the authority of mainland China. Confucians were arguing for the continuing relevance of their teachings in a modern world. And one of the seminal statements of this is a document with a number of co-authors who were leading intellectuals at the time, Manifesto on Behalf of Chinese Culture, respectfully submitted to the people of the world. This document, and I'll provide a link to a partial translation of it, is sometimes called the New Confucian Manifesto, even though the phrase New Confucian never occurs in it. And there's a number of co-authors of this work, but the two most famous co-authors of the so-called New Confucian Manifesto are Mo Zhongshan and Tang Junyi, who continue, they're both past now, but continue to be very influential thinkers in the New Confucian movement. And to this day, there are people who trace their intellectual lineage back to one or the other of these two guys. Now, Mao passed away in 1976, and this brought the Cultural Revolution to an end. And there was a little bit of uncertainty about where China would go, but in the end, moderates in the Chinese government, led by this guy, Deng Xiaoping, took over the government. And they led China in a much more moderate direction politically. They opened China to the West. Vassar students were among the first groups of students to visit China after the end of the Cultural Revolution. And Deng Xiaoping initiated a number of economic reforms, allowing people to start their own businesses and to sell goods at a profit. And many people like me really got interested in China, in part because there was a surge of interest in China because it was opening to the West after years of comparative isolation under Mao Zedong. Now, the changes that occurred in China as a result of Deng's reform were massive. And so this is a photograph of the Pudong district in Shanghai in 1987. Look at the changes in between 1987 and 2013 due to the free market reforms in China. Isn't that amazing? Let's look at that again. So here's 87. There's 2013. Now, it doesn't mean that everything that's happened in China since then has been good, but certainly we've seen a massive economic and social changes in China due to the changes after the death of Mao Zedong. Now, how has this affected attitudes towards traditional Chinese thought? Well, this is Professor Yuan, and she published a book in Chinese which gave kind of a positive spin on Confucius. Not to be catty, but it's not really a deep work on Confucius, but it's a kind of popular and positive presentation of Confucian thought. And her work, translated into English as Confucius from the Heart, sold 10 million copies in China. And knowing China, that means that at least another 10 million copies were pirated. And the popularity of this work showed that Chinese people were really hungry for a positive presentation of the thought of Confucius. This is a Chinese government postal stamp. I've got this in my personal collection, and it's from a series of ancient thinkers. And if you think about the way that Confucius was excoriated and condemned as a reactionary feudal thinker in the Cultural Revolution, it shows you how far China has come, that now we have Confucius represented on an official stamp honoring him. Perhaps the most amazing thing is that China's current leader, Xi Jinping, has actually said many positive things about Confucianism. And this is the English version of an authorized book which collects Xi Jinping's comments from classic texts, mostly Confucian texts, explaining what their origin is and how Xi Jinping is using them. And it reflects this endorsement of Confucianism by Xi Jinping, who has said that Chinese communism is, in fact, the protector and the true inheritor of the Confucian tradition. And I said in an earlier lecture that Xi Jinping has said that his favorite non-Marxist philosopher is the Confucian philosopher Wang Yang. So it's really an amazing transformation in terms of attitudes towards Confucius. Now, personally, I think Xi Jinping's appropriation of Confucianism is opportunistic. Just my personal opinion, but I think that Xi Jinping says he likes Confucianism the way many American politicians say that they're good Christians. I mean, they're saying that for nationalistic and opportunistic reasons. And so I think the same is true of Xi Jinping. But the thing I always say, there's a danger in having students read the classics, which is that they might actually do it and they might actually pay attention. And traditionally, Confucianism has very often been used to criticize the status quo and to criticize politicians who are self-serving, and to argue for a better government care of the least well-off in society. And people might actually get that message from reading the Confucian classics. So what are China's current intellectual trends? Well, remember before I showed you three trends in early 20th century Chinese thought, liberals, communists, and new Confucians. Well, guess what? The three major trends in contemporary Chinese thought are liberals, new left thinkers, and new Confucians. So there's no one figure who's the leader of each of these movements, but as representative, I gave you Guo Yuhua, who's one of several liberal thinkers. Again, Chinese liberal thinkers are divided between like classic advocates of classic free market and people who emphasize more the importance of representative democracy and human rights as protected by the courts. Some Chinese liberals are huge fans of Donald Trump because they believe the American conservative claim that the fight in America is between the communists and the Republican Party. And so there are some people who are big Trump supporters in China. Other liberals, though, have what I think is a more realistic view of the American political landscape, and they realize that Trump is not truly a representative of classic liberal thought, and they're critics of Trump. But in general, whatever they are, liberals in China are generally critics of the reigning Chinese government. New left thinkers they're not typically Maoists. There were Maoists earlier, people who still wanted to go back to the days of Mao Zedong. But contemporary New Left thinkers are people who usually are broadly supportive of the contemporary government. And they think that China offers a model of government and a model of how the economy can work, which is an attractive alternative to the chaos that they find in the Western capitalistic democracies. New Confucians, Jiang Qing is one of several famous contemporary New Confucians. Again, broadly, what's distinctive about New Confucianism is the belief that Confucianism has something to teach the modern world, while acknowledging generally that Confucianism has to adapt to contemporary conditions. Historically, New Confucians like Mo Zhongshan and Tang Junyi have also been advocates of Western-style democracy. Jiang Qing is a very kind of radical thinker in that he wants to make China a constitutional monarchy with a tricameral, three-house legislature, with one house democratically elected, one house basically based on heredity, whether your ancestors had certain high status or not, and one house based on merit, as determined largely by things like your success in being tested on the 5 books and the 4 classics. This is kind of an out there view, but there are people who advocate this in China today. I'm going to put a link in the description of this talk to Reading the China Dream website, which is a wonderful website that's translating contemporary Chinese intellectuals writing about world affairs and Chinese affairs, and they tend to emphasize thinkers who are less well known in the West, like the New Left or New Confucian thinkers, but they also have selections from contemporary Chinese liberal thinkers like Guo Yuhua. So we've seen in today's lecture that it's been a really fascinating and wild ride from the Qing Dynasty to contemporary China. China has gone from being bullied by European powers and also by Japan to being itself a great world power. And the future of China intellectually continues to be in dispute. Whether liberals or New Left or New Confucian thinkers will dominate in the long run remains to be seen. But whichever it is, I think we can agree that an understanding of traditional Chinese thought, both its strengths and weaknesses, is very valuable and important for understanding where China is going in the future. And I hope that if you're not already studying the Chinese language, you will consider doing so. The United States needs going forward people who are knowledgeable about China, who can read Chinese texts in the original language, because China is going to be a major power going forward in the future, and we need sinologues, experts on China, who can help navigate the strains of U.S.-China relations going forward. And you have an opportunity to be that kind of person. And Vassar has a very strong Department of Chinese Japanese. So I hope you will study these things. So again, thank you very much for the course, for your attendance and your interest in the course. And again, all these lectures are available on YouTube if you'd like to review them. And going forward, I'm sure I'll add more lectures in the future. So thank you very much for your time.